The sun hung low over the New Mexico territory, painting the desert floor in shades of copper and gold. 8-year-old Emma Porter carried the wooden bucket with both hands, her small arms straining against its weight even though it was empty. The path from her family's cabin to the well was nearly half a mile, and she had walked it twice every day for the past 3 months, ever since her mother took sick. The cabin sat isolated on the edge of Silver Creek, a settlement too small to appear on most maps and too poor to attract a proper doctor. Emma's father had left 6 months ago, promising to return from the silver mines in Colorado with enough money to see them through the winter. That was before the fever came, before her mother's cough turned deep and rattling, before Emma learned what it meant to be alone in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of people, and everything to do with the weight of responsibility, pressing down on shoulders too young to bear it. She hummed as she walked, a tune her mother used to sing when times were better. The melody helped push back the silence that seemed to grow thicker each day, the kind of silence that made a child aware of every shadow and every distant sound. The well stood at the edge of town, a stone structure built by the first settlers, surrounded by a few scattered buildings that made up what passed for Silver Creek Center. Most days, Emma saw no one on her journey. The townspeople kept to themselves, and a small girl fetching water was hardly worth notice in a place where everyone fought their own battles against the unforgiving land. But on this particular evening, as Emma reached the well and set her bucket down with a relieved sigh, she noticed a man standing near the livery stable. He was tall, with dust-covered clothes and a wide, brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A horse stood beside him, a magnificent paint with markings like spilled ink on clean paper. The man was watching her, and Emma felt her heart quicken the way it did when she spotted a coyote near the cabin at dusk. She lowered the bucket into the well, listening to the familiar splash far below, and began turning the crank to bring it back up. Her arms ached before she was halfway done. The rope was rough against her palms, and she had calluses now where her hands had been soft before her mother's illness. The man's boots made soft sounds in the dirt as he approached. Emma kept her eyes on the crank, turning it with fierce determination, though every instinct told her to look up, to measure the threat. She had learned caution from her mother's warnings and from the simple fact of being small in a world built for the strong. "Are you alone?" The man's voice was quiet, roughened by trail dust and wind. Emma's hands froze on the crank. She had been taught never to speak to strangers, never to admit vulnerability, never to show fear. But she was tired, so tired, and the bucket was still only halfway up, and her mother was waiting for water to ease her burning throat. "My pa's just over there," she lied, gesturing vaguely toward the buildings. "He'll be along directly." The man was silent for a moment. Then he moved closer and Emma's muscles tensed, ready to run even though she knew she couldn't leave the bucket. Without the water, her mother wouldn't drink, wouldn't take the bitter herbs that were all they had for medicine, wouldn't make it through another night. But the man didn't reach for her. Instead, he reached for the crank. His hands, large and scarred and surprisingly gentle, closed over the rope above hers. "Let me help," he said simply. Emma stepped back, watching as he turned the crank with easy strength, bringing the full bucket up in moments. Water sloshed over the sides, precious drops darkening the dirt. He lifted the bucket out and set it carefully on the stone edge of the well. "Thank you, mister," Emma said quietly, the words automatic, taught by a mother who insisted on manners even in the hardest times. The man pushed his hat back, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 30, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. There was something in his expression that made her think of her father, though they looked nothing alike. It was a kind of wariness, the bone deep tired that came from carrying more than a body ought to carry. "Where's your pa really?" he asked, and his voice held no accusation, only a quiet understanding that made Emma's careful lie seem foolish. She looked down at her worn boots, at the hem of her dress that had been let down twice and couldn't be let down anymore. "Colorado," she admitted. "The mines. And your ma, sick." The word came out small and frightened, and Emma hated the sound of it, hated admitting what she tried so hard to keep hidden. Sick meant weak, meant vulnerable, meant that the wolves who came in human form might see them as easy prey. The man nodded slowly. He pulled a canteen from his belt, uncapped it, and took a drink before offering it to her. Emma hesitated, then accepted it. The water was cool and tasted faintly of metal, and she drank deeply before remembering her manners and handing it back. "Name's Jack Brennan," the man said. "I'm passing through, looking for work. Don't suppose your ma needs help around the place?" Emma wanted to say yes. She wanted to say that the roof leaked in 3 places, that the fence needed mending, that the woodpile was running low and she could barely lift the axe. But accepting help meant admitting need, and admitting need meant opening the door to danger. Her mother had told her stories, warnings dressed up as tales, about men who took advantage of women alone, about kindness that turned cruel, about the 100 ways the world could hurt those who had no one to protect them. "We managed just fine," Emma said, lifting her chin the way she'd seen her mother do when the shopkeeper tried to sell her spoiled meat at full price. Jack Brennan studied her for a long moment, and Emma felt as though he could see right through her thin dress and sun-browned skin to the fear that lived in her chest like a caged bird. Then he nodded. "I'm sure you do," he said, "but I'll be staying at the boarding house for a spell if you change your mind. Mrs. Patterson's place, up the road." He touched the brim of his hat and turned away, leading his horse toward the stable. Emma watched him go, then lifted the bucket with both hands and began the long walk home. The water sloshed against her legs, soaking her dress, but she didn't stop to rest. The sun was sinking fast, and her mother would be wondering where she was. The cabin was dark when she pushed through the door. Her mother lay on the narrow bed in the corner, her face pale and damp with sweat despite the coolness of the evening. Emma set the bucket down and dipped a cloth in the water, wringing it out before pressing it to her mother's forehead. "Emma," her mother's voice was a whisper, barely audible. "I'm here, Mama." Emma smoothed the hair back from her mother's face, hair that had once been thick and dark and beautiful, now limp and lifeless as old straw. "You were gone so long. I was worried. Just took my time is all. Watched the sunset." The lie came easily, another skill she'd learned in recent months. Her mother didn't need to know about Jack Brennan, didn't need another worry added to the pile that seemed to crush her more each day. Emma prepared their supper, a thin soup made from the last of the dried beans and a bit of salt pork. Her mother managed 3 spoonfuls before turning her head away, exhausted by the effort of eating. Emma finished the rest, scraping the pot clean, then washed the dishes in water from yesterday's trip to the well. Everything was used and reused until it couldn't be used anymore. Waste was a luxury they couldn't afford. That night, Emma lay on her pallet on the floor and listened to her mother's breathing, counting the seconds between each rattling inhale and shaky exhale. She thought about Jack Brennan's offer, about the roof that leaked and the fence that sagged and the firewood they'd need when winter came. She thought about her father, somewhere far away, not knowing that every day without him brought them closer to a disaster that a child's determination couldn't prevent. The next morning, Emma woke before dawn and made the trip to the well in darkness, afraid that if she waited, she might see Jack Brennan again and her resolve might waver. But when she returned that evening, he was there, sitting on the edge of the well's stone wall, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that caught the dying light. He looked up as she approached but didn't stand evening. He said simply. Emma nodded, setting down her bucket. She lowered it into the well, began to crank, and felt the familiar burn in her shoulders before she'd completed 3 turns. Then Jack was beside her, his hands on the crank, lifting the weight that was too much for her. "I don't need help," Emma said, but the words were reflexive, empty of conviction. "I know," Jack replied, "but I'm offering it anyway." When the bucket was full, he didn't immediately step away. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket and held it out to her. It was the piece of wood he'd been whittling, carved into the shape of a small horse, its proportions perfect, its details fine enough that Emma could see the individual strands of its mane. "For you," he said. "Figured you might like it." Emma took the carved horse carefully, turning it over in her hands. She couldn't remember the last time someone had given her something that wasn't necessary for survival. The gift felt foreign, too precious, dangerous in a way she couldn't quite name. "Why?" she asked. Jack shrugged. "My daughter would have been about your age," he said quietly. If she'd lived. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a grief that Emma recognized even if she couldn't fully understand it. She thought of her mother's stories, the warnings about strangers, and tried to reconcile them with the sadness in this man's eyes. "I'm sorry," she said finally, because it was true and because she didn't know what else to say. Jack nodded. "So am I," he gestured to the bucket. "Let me walk you back. It's getting dark." and there's been talk of raiders in the territory." This time, Emma didn't refuse. They walked in silence, Jack carrying the bucket as though it weighed nothing, Emma clutching the carved horse. When they reached the cabin, her mother was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support, her face tight with worry and suspicion. "Emma, come inside," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks, sharpened by fear. "He helped me with the water, Mama," Emma said quickly. "That's all." Jack set the bucket down on the porch and stepped back, his hands visible and empty. "Mom," he said, "I meant no harm. Name's Jack Brennan. I've taken a room in town, and I noticed your daughter's been hauling water alone. Thought she could use a hand." Emma's mother studied him with eyes that had learned to see through pretense and deception. She saw his careful distance, his respectful posture, the way he'd already started backing away. She saw, too, the exhaustion in her daughter's face, the calluses on her small hands, the weight of responsibility that no child should carry. "We don't have money to pay you," she said finally. "Didn't ask for any," Jack replied. "I'll be working for the Hendersons, helping with their harvest. I pass by here on the way to their spread. Wouldn't be any trouble to stop by, check on things." Emma watched her mother wage an internal war between pride and desperation. Pride had kept them alive this long, kept them from becoming objects of pity or prey. But desperation was winning, as it always did eventually, wearing down resistance like water wearing down stone. "The roof leaks," her mother said, and the admission seemed to cost her something vital. "And the fence needs mending." Jack nodded. "I'll bring my tools tomorrow." He left then, disappearing into the gathering darkness, and Emma and her mother stood together on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant howl of coyotes and the whisper of wind through sage. "Be careful, Emma," her mother said softly. "The world is full of men who seem kind at first." "Yes, Mama," Emma replied, but she was thinking of the carved horse in her pocket, of the gentleness in Jack's hands when he lifted the bucket, of the sadness in his eyes when he mentioned his daughter. Jack Brennan returned the next morning, arriving just after dawn with a toolbox slung over his shoulder and lumber tied to his horse. He worked on the roof first, replacing shingles and sealing the leaks, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. Emma watched from the yard, supposedly hanging laundry, but really trying to understand this man who'd appeared in their lives like an answer to a prayer. She'd been too proud to speak aloud. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He mended the fence, restacked the woodpile, fixed the door that had hung crooked for months. He never came inside, never asked for anything, never stayed longer than the work required. He was simply there, steady and reliable as the sunrise, asking nothing and giving everything. Emma's mother watched him with wary gratitude, her strength slowly returning as the burden on their small household lightened. She began to sit on the porch in the afternoons, wrapped in a quilt, her cough gradually loosening its grip on her chest. She never said much to Jack, but Emma noticed the way her suspicion softened into something like acceptance, and then, finally, into trust. For Emma, Jack's presence transformed everything. The walk to the well became something to look forward to rather than dread. He taught her how to judge the best time to draw water, when it would be coolest and clearest. He showed her how to tie knots that wouldn't slip, how to stack wood so it would stay dry, how to read the sky for signs of coming weather. He never talked down to her, never treated her like a child who couldn't understand, and in return, Emma began to talk to him about things she'd never said aloud before. She told him about her fear that her father wouldn't come back, about the nightmares where her mother stopped breathing and she was left completely alone. She told him about the shopkeeper who'd tried to cheat them, about the other children who'd stopped inviting her to play, because everyone knew her family was poor and unlucky, about the way loneliness felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Jack listened to all of it without judgment or easy reassurances. He didn't tell her everything would be fine, didn't promise that her father would return or her mother would fully recover. Instead, he told her the truth, that life was hard and often unfair, that bad things happened to good people, but that strength came from facing difficulties head on rather than pretending they didn't exist. "The bravest person I ever knew was a woman about your size," he said one evening as they walked back from the well. "My wife. She was small like you, but she had a will like iron. When the fever took our daughter, I wanted to give up, wanted to just lie down and let the grief take me too. But she wouldn't let me. She said grief was heavy, but it didn't have to crush you. You could carry it, learn to bear its weight, and keep walking forward. What happened to her? Emma asked, though she already knew from the past tense, from the sorrow that never quite left his eyes. Same fever, 2 months later. Took her quick. Jack was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as he fought to keep his voice steady. I spent a year after that just drifting, running from memories, drinking away the pain. Woke up one morning in a jail cell in Texas, couldn't even remember how I'd got there. The sheriff was a good man. Instead of throwing me in prison, he offered me work, told me I could spend my life running from grief, or I could carry it with me and use it to do some good. That's what I've been trying to do ever since. Emma thought about this, about how carrying grief could make a person stronger rather than weaker. She thought about her mother, still fighting even when it would be easier to give up, and about herself, walking to the well every day even when her arms ached and her feet blistered. "Is that why you helped us?" she asked. "To do some good?" Jack smiled, the first real smile she'd seen on his face. "Maybe at first," he admitted. "But now it's because I want to. You and your ma, you've got that same iron will. It's worth protecting." 3 weeks after Jack Brennan first appeared at the well, a rider came to the cabin at sunset. Emma saw him from the porch where she sat shelling beans, and her heart leaped with hope that turned immediately to fear. The man was dusty from hard travel, his horse lathered and blown, and even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. Jack was there, working on a new chicken coop he'd insisted they needed. He straightened when he saw the rider, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip, a gesture Emma had never seen him make before. The rider pulled up in the yard, and Emma's mother emerged from the cabin, moving slowly but with her old determination. The man removed his hat and nodded to them respectfully. "Mom," he said, "I'm looking for Mrs. Catherine Porter." "I'm Catherine Porter," Emma's mother said, and her voice was steady despite the fear Emma could see in her eyes. "I work for the Colorado Mining Company," the man continued. "I'm sorry to bring bad news, Mom. There was an accident in the mines 3 weeks back, a cave-in. Several men were killed and others were injured." He paused, and in that pause Emma felt the world tilt sideways. "Your husband, Thomas Porter, he was caught in the collapse. They got him out, but he was hurt bad. Broken leg, broken ribs, head injury. He's alive, ma'am, but he can't travel. He's been asking for you." Emma's mother swayed, and Jack moved quickly to her side, supporting her with a hand on her elbow. Emma felt frozen, caught between relief that her father was alive and terror at what this news meant. Colorado was weeks away by wagon, and they had no money for passage, no way to reach him. "Where is he?" her mother asked. "St. Mary's Hospital in Denver. The company's covering his medical costs, and they sent me with this." He pulled an envelope from his jacket and handed it to her. "Wages owed, plus a settlement for the accident. It's not much, but it should help." Emma's mother opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were bills, more money than Emma had seen in her entire life. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I have to go to him," she said. "But I can't leave Emma alone, and I can't take her on such a journey, not while I'm still recovering, not with winter coming." Her voice broke on the last words, desperation and helplessness warring in her expression. "She won't be alone," Jack said quietly. "If you'll trust me, I'll stay here with her until you get back. Keep the cabin maintained, make sure she's fed and safe. You have my word, ma'am, on my daughter's memory, that no harm will come to her while she's in my care." Emma's mother looked at Jack for a long moment, weighing trust against necessity, measuring the man against the risk. Emma held her breath, understanding that this decision would change everything, that her mother was being asked to do the impossible. Leave her child with a man they'd known for less than a month, trusting that his kindness was real and not a mask for darker intentions. "You barely know us," her mother said. "Why would you do this?" "Because someone helped me once when I didn't deserve it," Jack replied. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing but hope and determination. Because your daughter's been carrying a weight that would break most grown men, and she deserves better. Because it's the right thing to do." He paused, then added softly, "And because I couldn't save my own daughter, but maybe I can help save someone else's family." Catherine Porter closed her eyes, and Emma saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer. When she opened them again, her decision was made. "All right," she said. "I'll trust you, Mr. Brennan. Help us both if I'm wrong." The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Emma's mother arranged for passage on a freight wagon heading to Denver. packing a small bag with the few things she could carry. She left money for supplies and gave Jack detailed instructions about Emma's care, her tone fierce with protective love and desperate fear. The morning she left, Emma stood in the yard and tried not to cry. Her mother held her tight, whispering promises into her hair. "Your father and I will come back," she said. "I swear it, Emma. We will come back for you." "I know, Mama," Emma said, and she meant it, even as fear clawed at her throat. She watched the wagon disappear into the distance, dust rising in its wake, and felt the loneliness that had been her constant companion for months settle over her like a familiar coat. But when she turned back to the cabin, Jack was there, his expression kind and understanding. "Come on," he said. "Let's go check on those chickens. I think the brown one's about to lay eggs." Life fell into a routine after that. Jack slept in the barn, rising before dawn to do the heavy work around the property. Emma maintained the cabin, cooked their meals, and tried to keep up with her schoolwork from the books her mother had left. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, and Jack told her stories about the places he'd been and the things he'd seen. He never tried to replace her parents, never overstepped the boundaries of his role, but he was there, constant and steady, when the nightmares came or the loneliness grew too heavy to bear. Word spread through Silver Creek about the arrangement, and Emma noticed the way some people looked at them with suspicion or judgment. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house came by once, her face tight with concern, clearly worried about the propriety of a man staying alone with a child. But when she saw the separate sleeping arrangements, saw the respectful distance Jack maintained, saw Emma healthy and content and clearly well cared for, her disapproval melted into grudging approval. "You're a good man, Mr. Brennan," she said as she left. "Not many would do what you're doing. Not many would trust a stranger the way Mrs. Porter did," Jack replied. 6 weeks after her mother left, Emma stood at the well one evening, cranking up the bucket by herself. She'd grown stronger in recent weeks, her arms corded with new muscle, her hands rougher but more capable. Jack stood nearby, watching but not helping, knowing that she needed to feel her own strength. The bucket reached the top, and Emma lifted it out with only a slight grunt of effort. She set it on the stone wall and looked at Jack with a grin of triumph. "I did it," she said. "All by myself." "You did," Jack agreed. "But you were never really alone, were you?" Emma thought about this. She thought about all the mornings when she'd woken to find Jack had already started the fire and made coffee. She thought about the evenings spent listening to his stories, learning from his experience. She thought about how fear had gradually transformed into confidence, how loneliness had been replaced by companionship. "No," she said finally. "I guess I wasn't." They walked back to the cabin together, the bucket swinging between them, each holding one side of the handle. The sun painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Emma thought of her parents, somewhere far away, fighting their own battles, and she sent up a silent prayer for their safety. But for the first time in months, the prayer wasn't desperate or frightened. It was hopeful. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that transformed the desert into something strange and beautiful. Jack taught Emma how to track animals in the fresh powder, how to read their signs and understand their movements. They hunted rabbit and quail, smoked the meat for storage, and made sure the chickens stayed warm in their coop. The cabin was snug and weatherproof now, all its leaks sealed, its doors hung straight, its windows tight against the wind. On Christmas Eve, Jack produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a new dress, deep blue calico with white flowers, and a pair of sturdy boots that actually fit. Emma looked at the gifts with wide eyes, then at Jack. "How did you know my size?" she asked. "Mrs. Patterson helped," he admitted. "Said every girl deserves something nice for Christmas." Emma hugged the dress to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness of it, by the thoughtfulness that had gone into choosing something practical but also pretty. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome, Emma." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. "You've been the bravest person I've known. You deserve good things." That night, they sat by the fire and Jack told her about his daughter, about her laugh and her curiosity, and the way she'd loved to collect interesting stones from the river. He talked about his wife, about her strength and her gentleness, and the way she'd made their small cabin feel like a palace. He cried as he talked, and Emma sat beside him and held his hand, understanding that grief didn't disappear, but that it could be shared, and that sharing made it bearable. "You've helped me as much as I've helped you," Jack said finally. You gave me a reason to stop drifting. You reminded me that there's still good in the world, still things worth protecting. You saved us, Emma said simply. Mama and me, we wouldn't have made it without you. You would have? Jack corrected gently. But I'm glad I could make it easier. The letter arrived in January, brought by the same freight wagon that had carried Emma's mother away. Jack read it aloud while Emma stood beside him, hardly daring to breathe. Catherine Porter's handwriting was shaky but clear. Thomas was recovering slowly but steadily. The doctor said he'd walk again, though he'd always have a limp. They would stay in Denver through the winter, but when spring came, they'd return to Silver Creek. They'd saved enough money from the settlement to start fresh. Maybe buy a proper ranch, build a real future. And they wanted Jack to know that there would always be a place for him with them, if he wanted it. They owed him more than they could ever repay, and they hoped he'd consider himself part of their family. Emma looked up at Jack, saw the tears in his eyes, and understood that the loneliness that had haunted him for so long was finally beginning to lift. "Will you stay?" she asked. "When they come back, will you stay with us?" Jack knelt down so he was eye level with her, his hands on her shoulders. "If your parents will have me," he said. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the desert into a riot of color. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, painting the brown earth with scarlet and gold and purple. Emma spent her days preparing the cabin for her parents' return, cleaning and organizing, making everything perfect. She was at the well one afternoon, filling her bucket for what she hoped would be one of the last times she'd have to do it alone, when she saw the wagon. Her heart leaped, and she dropped the bucket, letting it fall back into the well with a distant splash. She ran toward the wagon, her new boots kicking up dust, her blue dress streaming behind her. Her mother saw her first, crying out and waving from the wagon seat. Her father sat beside her, thinner than Emma remembered and using a cane, but alive and smiling. Emma crashed into them as they climbed down, hugging them both with a ferocity that made them laugh and cry at the same time. "Look at you," her mother said, holding Emma at arm's length. "You've grown so tall and so strong. I can carry the water bucket all by myself now," Emma said proudly. "I know you can, sweetheart," her mother replied, pulling her close again. "I know you can." Jack stood back, giving them space for their reunion, but Emma's father noticed him and limped over, his hand extended. "Mr. Brennan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't have words sufficient to thank you. You saved my family." Jack shook his hand firmly. "They saved me too," he said quietly. "More than they know. The offer stands," Emma's father continued. "We're buying the Henderson place, 40 acres with good water and grazing land. We need a partner, someone we trust, someone who'll treat it like his own, because it would be 1/3 ownership, equal share in everything. We'll build it together." Jack looked at Emma, at her parents, at the cabin that had become home. He thought about drifting and running and trying to outrace grief. He thought about his daughter, about what she would want for him, about the redemption that came not from forgetting the past but from honoring it by building a better future. "I accept," he said. "It would be an honor." That evening, they all stood together on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over the land that had tested them and shaped them and ultimately brought them together. Emma stood between her parents, Jack beside them, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt completely safe. "We're going to name the ranch Silver Creek," her father announced, "in honor of this place and the well that brought us all together." Emma thought about the well, about all those lonely trips carrying water that had seemed impossibly heavy. She thought about the day Jack had asked if she was alone, and about how that simple question had changed everything. She thought about strength and courage, and the kindness of strangers who became family. The Silver Creek Ranch, she repeated, testing the words. They felt right, solid and true, a promise of better days ahead. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast western sky, they went inside together. The cabin was crowded now with 4 people instead of 2, but no one minded. They gathered around the table, sharing a meal that Emma and Jack had prepared together, talking and laughing and making plans for the future. Later, as Emma lay on her pallet, she listened to the familiar sounds of her parents breathing, the creak of floorboards as Jack settled into his corner, and the whisper of wind through the eaves. She thought about all she'd learned in the months of her mother's illness, about carrying weight and facing fear, and finding strength she didn't know she had. But most of all, she thought about the truth that Jack had taught her, not through words but through example, that no one is truly alone as long as there are people willing to help carry the burden, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the family you choose is just as strong as the family you're born into. Outside, the desert night was cold and vast and filled with unknown dangers. But inside the cabin at Silver Creek, there was warmth and light and love, and a little girl who'd learned that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom, that accepting kindness wasn't surrender but strength, and that the bravest thing anyone could do was keep walking forward, one step at a time. Even when the path seemed impossible, the well still stood at the edge of town, its stone walls weathered and strong. Emma would return to it many times over the years, but never again alone. There would always be someone to help carry the weight, to share the burden, to remind her that isolation was a choice and connection was always possible, even in the loneliest places. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the light was just right, she'd take out the carved wooden horse that Jack had made for her all those months ago. She'd run her fingers over its smooth surface, remembering the man who'd appeared at the well and asked a simple question that changed everything. Are you alone? The answer she now knew was always no. Not anymore. Not ever again.